All right, as we conclude our time in the world of the text and learning how to read the biblical text, the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to think about aims for the original audience. And so, what are aims? So, in light of the context, text, and theology that we've just been looking at and studying, what were the author's intended messages for the original audience? Now, we can't get into the mind of the author, and there's been debate in biblical studies as to how much we can know about what the author was intending. But I think through our careful study of the passage, we can get some idea of what maybe the author was intending, the messages that he was intending to communicate to his original audience. And so the thing that we want to think about, though, too, is that he wasn't just intending to communicate information. He was seeking to do more than that. Some of it was information, but also part of his message was that they would obey as well. They would be conformed to the image of Christ. And so we want to think through now, what were the author's intended messages for our three passages here? So we got a Luke 7 passage in the woman, the Pharisee's house. What are the aims? What was Luke aiming for in this passage? As best as I can tell, I would say Luke wanted his audience. And again, I want to use this language very carefully, that we're talking about Luke and his original audience. Luke wanted his audience to believe Jesus' identity as God. Again, we were talking about that being fairly central to this passage. Luke wanted his audience to extravagantly worship Jesus as those who have been greatly forgiven. And Luke desired for his audience to understand that self-righteousness is a barrier to truly knowing and loving Christ. Now, again, think of all the work that we've done up to this point, and think particularly about theology in the passage. We talked about the fallen condition, what we learned about God. We, after we studied the passage and looked at what the author was emphasizing, the structure of the passage, all that stuff. We talked about ethics then as well. These things are all just a kind of a byproduct. We've done all of our work, and these aren't very hard to come up with then if you've done all the work leading up to this. So these aren't very different even from some of the ethical points that Luke was trying to, that we came up with in our last video. Okay, so then let's look at Genesis 21. All right, so we're talking again about Hagar and Ishmael. What was Moses trying to communicate to those Israelites that were in the wilderness? Okay, Moses wanted the Israelites in the wilderness to know that God could be trusted even with their children. This is interesting because what was the Israelites' major complaint about not wanting to go into the land that God had promised them after the spies came back? Well, they were worried about their children, it says. And so here you have this story of this woman from Egypt. Again, here are these people from Egypt, these Israelites that have come out of captivity in Egypt, who were slaves, who had children, and then this woman, the slave woman, had a child. And I think what Moses was saying in this story is that God can be trusted even with your children. But believe his promise. He's going to make you into a great nation. Believe him. Next, Moses wanted them to know that despite the fact that they might have meager provisions, God could provide even when they felt like they were on the verge of dying, which they felt like. Moses wanted them to know that God hears their cries. And then Moses wanted them to know that if God can make a great nation out of a slave woman and her son, God can make a great nation out of slaves who are the children of promise. Kind of like what I said in the first point. Okay, so let's now go over to Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. And it says, I would say that some of the aims here for Ephesians 2, 1 through 10 are Paul wanted the Ephesian believers to be reminded of the grace of the gospel that is theirs through faith. I remember I mentioned earlier in the other video about just the reminder of that these saints needed. The reminder that all of us need. but he wanted to remind them of the grace of the gospel that is theirs in Christ, or through faith in Christ. He wanted them to realize that they have been created for, what they have been created for is not who they once were. Okay? So they walked in disobedience according to the course of the world, but now who they are is that they're created in Christ for good works. He wanted them to recognize that they had been made alive, raised, and seated permanently with Christ. And he wanted them to live out the work that God was working into their lives. Okay, so I think these are some of the aims that Paul was after. So as you think about passage that you come to, you want to think through, okay, what was, after you've done all your pre-work, what was the author seeking to communicate, the intended messages for their original audience?